more news from the world over. President Donald Trump said Thursday he is ready and well prepared for his upcoming summit with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. The president insists that it will be more than a photo op. Trump made the comments while hosting Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in the Oval Office. Abe requested the meeting to discuss the summit and ensure Japan's interests are represented. He said the Trump-Kim meeting is an opportunity for greater peace and stability and will be a dramatic and transformational moment for Northeastern Asia. Trump, as well, was bullish.
North Korean representatives are in Singapore right now working very hard, as are people from the United States, and it's all going along very fine. I hope it continues on this track. If it does, the world will be a very happy place.
Joining me now with analysis is senior fellow at the Cato Institute and former special assistant to President Ronald Reagan, Doug Bandow. Doug, thanks for returning to the show. How significant is it that we're seeing this summit between North Korea and the United States with President Trump and Kim Jong-un at all? How significant is it?
It's a dramatic step. They talked about trying to do a summit back with President Clinton. It didn't happen. Since then, the relationship has been really in an utter deep freeze. So to have these two people meet, this is extraordinary.
Now, some are saying this will solidify Kim's rule over North Korea. Do you feel that way?
Well, what goes on in North Korea very much is internal, so we shouldn't assume that. It certainly helps him internationally. It presents him as being a serious leader. He's met with the Chinese. Putin has invited him. He's meeting with President Trump. That's very big internationally, but internally, this is a very strange place. So, you know, I wouldn't put anything past it.
Now, you were just there in the North. People don't often remember. We are still in a state of war, or on a war footing, between North and South Korea, and the United States has a serious military presence there. Do you see this ending, this summit, or the end result of it, with a declaration that that war has ended?
I think there's a good chance that's where this summit will go. You know, North and South Korea have talked about that. We have an armistice, not a treaty.
Right.
There's no peace, as you indicated. The president has talked about perhaps declaring this. The Chinese would be happy with that. So that might be one of the positive outcomes, that if we could lower those tensions, I think that would be helpful. And that might reduce some of those security concerns up north.
Former intelligence director James Clapper has called the summit a huge concession to the North Korean regime. He says it grants it legitimacy. Do you think that's a sober and right criticism?
Well, it's certainly a nice step for the North. I mean, Kim is stepping out here, and suddenly he's being accepted as a world leader. His summit with Moon showed that he's actually comfortable in the international stage. But I think there's an advantage to that. Yes, it's a concession in a sense. On the other hand, it actually shows him the benefits of playing ball, that he can come out and suddenly be recognized, perhaps have some influence, normalize his country. So it's a two-way street here. I think it's very important, and it's good for us to try to draw them out.
Now, the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, has been in North Korea, working, or in South Korea rather, working with the principals here in preparations for this summit. He said just this week, North Korea will receive relief only when it demonstrates verifiable and irreversible steps to denuclearization. Do you see that as being a reality coming out of this?
Well, what I would say is that they're likely to commit themselves to that. We're not going to see that coming out of this. This is going to take time. You know, the North Koreans are not going to give up all their leverage and then hope they get benefits out of it.
Well, can they be trusted? That's the real question. I mean, can they be trusted at all?
Well, of course not, which is why you have to set up a process of inspections. It's, in my mind, why you do step by step. We see you take a step before we give you anything. We have inspectors in there. One of the things we want is an inventory of their program, that we can go out there. How many nukes do they have? What assets do they have? We want to send in inspectors and check that.
Well, the president, part of the reason he blew up the summit the first time, a few weeks ago, was because they weren't allowing inspectors in. There was no inspection here. Will inspectors be allowed? And is it even, how do you know what you're seeing when you're dealing with a regime that is known as the Hermit Kingdom?
Well, it's going to be very hard. The estimates on nuclear weapons is anywhere between 15 and 60. You know, so they could throw a lot of these in tunnels or something. They could say, we have 20. How do we know? How do we check that? It's going to be an extremely difficult process, which is why it's If it happens, it'll take time.
What concessions do you think the North Koreans are going to ask of the United States going into this summit?
My guess is they're going to want to have some kind of economic relief. I think the starting point for us is a continued freeze on testing. We might want to give them something on that. That's something that's easy to monitor. No nuclear tests, no missile tests. That helps at least limit the program. The main thing, they may want to get U.S. troops out of there, but that's a much longer-term objective. I think short-term, it's economic.
Yeah, and James Mattis said there's no talk of getting rid of troops. Not this round, anyway. He said that's not within the realm of possibility. Senate Democrats have come up with a list of demands for North Korea. We're going to put them up on your screen. They say the deal has to include the dismantlement and removal of all nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons from North Korea. The U.S. must ensure a complete and verifiable denuclearization of the North. North Korea must end its ballistic missile program, and North Korea must comply with anywhere, anytime inspections to ensure it's not cheating on the deal, and the deal must be permanent. Are those Senate Democrats trying to set the president up for failure? This sounds like a pretty high bar.
No, this is a wish list. For example, I would say, yeah, we'd like to get to chemical and biological, but I'm worried about nuclear today. And the question is, again, a step by step. How do you make it irreversible? How do you make it verifiable? Do it step by step. Let's be realistic. The president deserves credit for having gotten this far. Let's not set an impossible objective when, in fact, we don't want the good, the perfect to be the enemy of the good.
Yeah. Last week, the president met with a high-ranking general, the number 2 to Kim Jong-un, at the White House, and he had this to say. Watch.
We're not going to go in and sign something on June 12th. We never were. We're going to start a process. And I told him today, take your time. You can go fast, we can go slowly. But I think they'd like to see something happen. And if we can work that out, that'd be good. But the process will begin on June 12th in Singapore.
What kind of process do you foresee, Doug Bandow?
I assume that what they're thinking of is a general commitment to denuclearization of the type that we have talked about, and then set up some goals and set up a regular negotiating system in which we're going to start moving toward that, where we recognize we expect to see continuing progress. That's going to be sending inspectors in. That means we want an inventory. That's going to several things, but we'll have to offer something in return as well.
As so often happens with this president, conventional wisdom ends up getting blown up in people's faces. And when that letter dropped, when President Trump wrote the letter and said, we're ending the summit, but my phone is here, call me if you reconsider, but you're too aggressive and I don't like the terms of this thing. People were saying, look at this crazy man. I was on the radio that day and I said, you know what? Stand back for a moment, take your emotions, your hatred or love of Donald Trump out of this. Might this be a negotiating tactic? Your thoughts on that decision by the president to blow up the first version of this summit?
Well, my guess is it didn't change the outcome dramatically, but what it may have done is send a message that the U.S. is prepared to walk away. And that is the important thing. People have worried that the president might be too desiring of having a win of some sort. It's important to communicate to the North Koreans we don't accept just anything, but in fact the president is prepared to say no if he doesn't think it's a good deal.
Some are saying the president may be falling into a trap here in that the North Koreans might be trying to lure the United States into a protracted peace process that buys them time to make other alliances and to strengthen the regime. Is that a possibility?
I would look at it as compared to what? That is, a military option is really not an option. I mean, we cannot afford to trigger a war in South Korea. It'd be horrendous. General Mattis and others have talked about how horrific it would be. So the point is we don't have many good options. So to my mind, what we see is if we can at least get some steps like halting testing, if we can draw them out where they see the benefits, if we can get support from China, there are things that I think move us forward where they're going to be no better off than they would have been otherwise, and I think we may be moving forward in a way we didn't have a chance before.
You mentioned China. What role have they played? It seems the president has kind of triangulated North Korea, using Japan, using China, the South Koreans certainly. What is the role of China? Some have sat in that chair and told me, we're really not dealing with North Korea, we're dealing with China. That is the puppet master for the North Korean puppet.
I simply don't believe that. If you look historically at North Korea, it has long played China against Russia. It's been resiliently independent. It does not like to be dominated. I think they want us there in some sense to play off of China. So China's been very frustrated. I think China wants to have a kind of a compliant puppet, and they don't have that. They want a buffer against the United States.
But they're very reliant on China for their economy, trade. It's one of the few partners they have in the world.
But realize from the standpoint of China, you don't want to blow up North Korea. Imagine the United States and Mexico. Would you want to blow up that regime, loose nuclear weapons, factional fighting, millions of refugees? And they don't want to have a reunification that is on American terms with U.S. troops on their border. So they want that buffer. So they've always been very concerned, how much pressure do we put on, but they don't like a buffer that's causing trouble, which is what the North is doing. So they've kind of had that both ways of how far do we go.
Well, what do you think the Chinese want from this June 12th summit?
They'd like to lower the temperature. They'd like to have military means put off the map. They'd like to see the North move towards some kind of denuclearization. They'd like to see the U.S. and South Korea move towards a peace agreement with the North. They'd be happy with that. From their standpoint, then they'd have a lot of investment in the North, a good relationship, but you wouldn't have all that instability and worry.
And you think Trump is using the possibility of trade, opening this market up? Will that be a lure, a powerful one for Kim Jong-un?
It appears to be. Kim Jong-un, in contrast to his father, seems to care a lot about economic development. And I think this is something he understands, that for his country to be an important country, it needs economic growth. It needs to have that kind of prosperity. I think that's something that is drawing him out.
Doug Bandow, thank you for being here.
Happy
and
to be
always
on.
For your
Absolutely.
insights. You can follow Doug Bandow's commentary at cato.org.